So, as I said, today we're going to be talking about the modern internet explained. So, we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of the internet over the past several decades, what the internet is like today, and some common misconceptions about how people behave on the internet. And finally, if we have a chance, we'll also discuss some security and privacy challenges, both what we're seeing currently and what Zakir is expecting in the future. So, to talk through the modern internet, we're joined by Zakir Durumeric, who is an assistant professor of computer science here at Stanford. His research brings a large-scale empirical approach to the study of internet security, trust, and safety. What that means in part is that he builds systems to measure complex networked ecosystems and uses those perspectives from those systems to understand real-world behavior, uncover weaknesses and attacks, and then architect and deploy more resilient approaches and guide public policy. So Zakir, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And maybe we can begin if you just could tell us a little bit more about what your research is and how you approach that research.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And folks, please don't hesitate to leave questions. There's so much that we could talk about. The internet is probably one of the most vast topics we could try to fit into one webinar, and always happy to dive into where people's heads are at. My name is Zakir Durumeric. I'm on the faculty in the computer science department here. And most broadly speaking, I study the internet. And this really spans all the way from understanding sort of the sort of plumbing of the cryptographic standards and how we securely communicate, how do we protect email and web transactions online, all the way up to how do people spend time on the internet, how do we protect against sort of abuse online, how do we look at where hate and harassment occurs online, and everything in between. And that's sort of what makes this sort of a fun topic is we have everything from sort of the people aspects on one end of it, all the way down to sort of cryptography and high-speed, high-performance systems and networking on the other side. The other piece, though, that makes the internet, I think, really interesting, but also really tough to challenge is just how distributed it is and how complex it is. You have hundreds of thousands of different networks, all run by different operators. You have businesses who are involved in the core of the internet, folks like AT&T and Verizon. You have different governments who have different opinions on what the internet should look like, what their citizens should and should not be able to view online, how they should interact online, what companies should be able to do online. There's sort of this innate political nature of the internet. You have these security and privacy concerns that are tied into this as well, of how do we provide people what they want on the internet while also maintaining their privacy and security on a daily basis. Security is one of those areas where there's an active adversary. And a lot of other parts of computer science, we're trying to build something that works faster or is more performant or is more stable. Here you actually have folks globally who are trying to break into these systems. And in a lot of cases, we don't necessarily have sort of the legal structure to stop that from happening internationally. And so the only solutions that we have are technical solutions for protecting against these attacks. And all of these things have to work together in order to provide the sort of experience that everyone has on a daily basis for much of our society to continue to function on a daily basis as more and more of the internet is sort of dependent on in our day-to-day lives.
That was already a lot, and I think we're going to get to some of those different aspects. So I want to maybe we'll start with user behavior, get into governance and business side of things, and I know you have an interesting background there. And then finally, maybe we can talk about the technical side and what you're seeing technically in terms of the infrastructure supporting the internet. Yeah. But maybe before we even jump into that, can we dig a little bit deeper on how you research the internet? I mean, for a system that is so distributed, that is so complex. I mean, it is, it's one of the great world systems, I guess, in some sense. Yeah. How do you even go about studying it empirically?
Yeah, we have to be really creative here because there isn't sort of like one central place where we can go and we can collect data and we can make sense of things. What you have is this giant sort of interconnected network. And so it really depends on the question you want to ask. In a lot of cases, what we'll try to do is we'll try to build systems that will go out and sort of be able to do large-scale measurements of what's happening in practice. And I think the big piece that drives this is The internet is far too complicated and messy, and there are far too many players for us to really be able to model any aspect of it, to sort of have these theories about how things work. For the most part, when we come up with theories, they break down in practice just because people have different incentives. They don't necessarily want what they want to have happen is not necessarily perfect performance. It might be sort of business driven or sort of financially driven. And so what we do is we try to go out and do these large scale measurements. Sometimes this means working with big providers, folks like Google or Cloudflare or Akamai or Amazon, and saying, across all of the traffic and all of the connections that come into you, what are the patterns that you're seeing? Can we come up with these experiments and work with you to run one of these experiments that doesn't hurt your performance too much, but lets us tease out sort of these patterns of behavior? Sometimes it means in going and actually like crawling massive parts of the web, going and connecting to these websites. How do you build these web crawlers that can connect to these websites, pull down content, analyze it sort of at this scale? One of the mechanisms that my group focuses on a lot is this notion of internet scanning. And the idea here is going out and connecting to every internet connected device, every router, every server, every cloud provider, and looking at in these connections to each one of these devices, sort of seeing what is the data that those devices give back to us, and sort of can we drive patterns by the little bit of information that is sent back. And you might think, how much data do these servers like really give you back that lets you make sense of the internet? But at times you're able to actually sort of glean out these patterns of behavior. And I think a really good example of this recently that we've been looking at is what does performance on low Earth orbit satellite networks look like? Now, this was something that in the past, right, low Earth orbits like networks, they're pretty new, right? Starlink was sort of the first player that brought this to sort of widespread consumers. And there's a lot of folks now that are getting access to the internet through these low Earth orbit satellites. And the problem is that how do you go out and do you measure this, right? One option could be you could try to buy a whole bunch of these satellite dishes. You could try to get people all over the world to put up these satellite dishes and tell you about their experience. And now you have this problem of like, how are we going to manage this sort of army of volunteers? And how do we make sure that the numbers that they get make sense? And what do they get out of this? Why do they want to help us measure their satellite performance? Like everyone knows globally, yes, we need to know this, but what incentivizes them as an individual to want to sort of participate in a study like this? But what we found was that we could see many of these actually satellite endpoints out there on the internet. And you can start to do measurements that say, sort of how quickly do packets go back and forth between Stanford and those satellite endpoints. And if you can do this for a couple of endpoints, it's not that necessarily that interesting, but if you can do this for thousands or tens of thousands of these endpoints, you can start to see patterns. You can start to see these are regions where things are faster or slower. These are places where the connectivity seems to not match sort of our theoretical model of how these satellite constellations work. And we could dig in and say, why does this sometimes match this theoretical model and sometimes not? What is it about how these satellites have been deployed, about how traffic is routed, about the behavior of users on these networks that lead to these actual sort of performance characteristics? And this is one example where we were able to sort of make sense of performance. But there's a lot of other places where we can do this to understand security, to understand sort of misconfigurations, to say, okay, if we look at every misconfigured web server, let's say in the world, what's the pattern that some of these are configured and some of these are not? Where are the places that people patch for vulnerabilities faster and places where they're not? We can go talk to those people and say, hey, why didn't you patch your web server like everyone else did? And be able to sort of tease apart why certain things work and why certain things don't work, and sort of update our models and come up with better solutions to build better technologies, build better protocols that sort of address these problems we're able to identify through these measurements.
That's super interesting. You're making me nervous. Have I patched around? Is everything on mine patched you? So we already got a quick question that maybe is worth asking right at the outset is, so when you're building these models or their scanners, the topic that's at the forefront of everyone's mind is machine learning, AI, neural networks. Are you starting to integrate some of those? And what would that look like into a scanner, into something that's probing for vulnerabilities at a internet-wide approach?
Yeah, this is a great question. It is a question that everyone's asking is like, what does machine learning really mean for security? And I generally have the opinion that machine learning in a lot of ways can kind of accelerate sort of different directions we're trying to take research. So for one example, for the measurements we're doing, we go out, we collect all of these devices, but there's this question of where are these devices? Right? Who owns them? Like, what industry are they in? Trying to make sense of that data is hard, right? People don't say this system belongs to utilities and this other one belongs to manufacturing. It's something you have to tease out and sort of be able to make sense of this data. And machine learning is really good there to sort of take these massive data sets and say, can they help us as researchers make sense of this data, to pull out these patterns where we know what's in there. And when you look at it, it's obvious to you as a human, right? Is this a website or is this a router? Right? That's something that you and I can look at and we can tell when we look at the website of that device. But there are so many different types of routers. There's so many different companies that make routers just in the US. And then you think globally, okay, you have all of these different routers made by all of these different manufacturers and their interfaces are in all of these different languages. How do we make sense of all that data is a place that we are turning to machine learning to say, how do we label this data? How do we make sense of this? How do we draw these connections out? And that's really where machine learning is going to, I think, really help us in the security space is saying, we have all of this data. We're trying to find these patterns. Which of these connections come from attackers versus our work from home users? Which of these is one of these users that is traveling this week or is an attacker? Even from a connection from someone's home machine, is that actually that employee? Or is it someone who's attacked and taken over that system and is making malicious connections from their computer? Like, how do you distinguish those things up? And we live in a world today where, for the most part, security systems are able to collect massive amounts of data. They're able to collect way more data than anyone in a SOC or in sort of a security organization is able to make sense of. The other place we're using it is to figure out not how to only make sense of everything we find, but how do you find everything? We used to think we knew how to find everything, and it turns out finding everything on the internet is actually quite hard, right? You have to think of the billions of different names of websites that are out there. You have to look at IPv6, which has this massive search space. There are 2 to the 128 IP addresses, right? This is more than sort of atoms in the known universe sort of numbers. It's not something we can ever measure all of it. So where do we even begin to look? And you can start to drive patterns to say people put routers on these addresses, but not these. Or this network tends to use this sort of addressing scheme. Or in this network, something's on this weird port that isn't anywhere else, but is on that network, seems to be a port that they use. And so also finding those patterns tells us where to look. And then once we find things on the internet, it helps us sort of derive these patterns from that data.
That's really interesting. Yeah, when you were saying you're going to look at every internet-connected device, the immediate question was, well, how do you find every internet-connected device? And there you go. It's hard to do.
It's hard. Yeah. And then they change, they move, right? Like all of this, none of this is static. And this is, things become blurry, right? If you look at sort of, hey, we're going to look over the internet over the span of a week. Well, you're going to count some things multiple times when they move around. You're going to miss other things that are only up during nighttime, but not during the daytime. And all of these sort of real world factors you have to address, or you'll miss countries worth of data because the weekend in that country and it's a weekday in this other part of the world.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. We had one more quick follow-up question on this. There was a very specific one about what tools you're using to do the satellite studies. But maybe more broadly, do you have examples of any tools? I know you've built some. Can you mention a few of these or what you're using to do these? Are these things you're building? Are there tools that are out there that people can use for this kind of research?
It's a little bit of both, but my lab does maintain many of sort of the big internet measurement tools. So we created a scanner called ZMAP. We also have other scanners like ZGrab and ZDNS, which we use and are used across the industry for doing these types of scans. ZMAP's sort of interesting because this year, there is another research group that came out that said the majority of all scans on the internet actually come out of ZMAP from the open source tools that we create and maintain. We also work with a lot of other companies. We work with groups like Census and Gray Noise, folks who are going off and doing these scans on a regular basis or are deploying honeypots. We work a lot of times with big organizations like Cloudflare and Google and those folks who have their perspective on the world. And so it really depends. A lot of the times we're developing tools and making them available to other researchers. We tend to dog food those and use them ourselves to figure out where did they work, where did they not work? And that's sort of important to us, is like, you don't really know how well a tool is going to solve a problem until you're the end user who has to use it and sort of has to bang your head against the wall and say, we thought this question would be easy to answer, but now that we're actually answering it, turns out to be pretty tough. We have a new system we've been working on the last couple of years called Retina, which lets us sort of ask questions of massive like internet service providers for all the traffic that goes through a network to ask questions like, how is cryptography being deployed? Where is cryptography broken? And that is a system that's sort of under active development, is one that allows us to make sense of network traffic and ask these sort of security questions of it.
We're getting a lot of really good questions. I want to hear a little bit more about your research. So maybe we can just, before I jump into the next round of audience questions, is just, you did a study a little while ago on the, what is it, a worldwide view of the World Wide Web. So I guess what I'd love to hear a little bit, and that was a study of user behavior on the internet. So maybe just starting with, what do you think is the common perception of user behavior on the internet? What were some of the surprising things that you found in that study? And maybe, again, saying a little bit about how you conducted that study, because I think that's interesting and important to understand why your answers might have been different.
Yes, this is one of those studies where it's kind of shocking that the study hadn't been done before to us. But this was a study that, for the first time, we looked at how do people actually spend time on the web. Right, we all spend all of this time on the web, but we actually had never really measured, like, where does time go? Like, if you're to look at sort of the whole world, the time they spend in like Chrome or Firefox, like, what are the websites they spend on? Like, how much of the internet goes to the top 5 websites versus all of the others, right? And this is something we had no idea. We had no idea, did 10% of traffic go to the top website, or does 50% of time go to the first website? And this was a project we did in collaboration with Google to say, essentially, where does time go on the web? And so what was surprising, it's hard to say, because I feel like we just had no idea going in. Like, we had so little idea of, like, where does this go? We oftentimes, I think, on the networking side, think of the world in terms of like how many packets go across the internet. And we know that the vast majority of packets belong to video, right? That's sort of like, that was the sort of what we knew going into this. In terms of what I think we found that was really interesting, is just how different like the desktop world is versus the mobile world. And really how much of the desktop world has moved to sort of business-centric sorts of things, and how much of time people spend on the internet is really on phones and is on mobile. And I think that looking at sort of, there's these entirely, it was like 2 different like types of traffic or user on the internet, depending on, are they at work or are they at home? And now that we say this, it's sort of like, well, duh, like, of course they do. But it was the first time we really had this sort of data that said, like, these are the types of things people do at work versus at home. And if you look at the weekdays versus the weekends, if you look at time during the day versus in the evenings, these look different. And they look different in sort of some surprising ways. So I think one of the things that's actually really surprising is that, for the most part, the security of the connections we see and of the emails sent and all of this is more secure during nights and weekends than it is during the weekday. And this seems sort of backwards, right? You would think that like people sending emails from work would be using more up-to-date technologies, more secure protocols. But it's actually the actual pure flip of it. Security of the internet, all the connections, is worse during work hours than it is during weekends. And a lot of this, what this comes down to, is that you have big providers like Gmail and Hotmail, right, and Yahoo, and these folks who actually have really good security. And all the connections that are made sort of on the weekends to these public services, they're all running HTTPS. They're all using sort of modern mail protocols. The people who are oftentimes behind at deploying these new technologies are businesses. It's banks and insurance companies and all of these other folks who say, we don't want to use some of these cloud services. We don't want to sort of have all of our email run through Google or Microsoft. We're going to run our own servers. And I think a lot of times companies think they're going to do is to improve their security. But what we see when we zoom out is these activities actually reduce their security as a whole, because folks like Google and Microsoft are keeping their servers up to date. They're deploying the newest protocols. They're involved in those protocols and writing those. And this sort of starts to get into these other questions of governance and sort of who's pushing the internet ahead, and the new protocols that are coming out tend to be these big tech companies, not the folks that people use during the day when they're at work.
That's incredibly interesting. So again, just to summarize, what I'm hearing is at night, right? Most people are using it for things like entertainment and personal email, and therefore they're going through major providers like a Netflix and Microsoft and Google, and they're all going to have the latest and the greatest in terms of security. And on the other hand, during the day, you have a lot of these small businesses or medium-sized businesses or even large businesses that are running their own servers, their own email, and therefore they're not necessarily as secure as what you're seeing.
Yep.
You alluded to it, but just to also maybe clarify a bit more, what you're seeing on phones is you're seeing that as kind of the go-to or mobile devices for entertainment, if I remember, broadly speaking, and then desktops probably more business or other similar activities.
Exactly. Most of the traffic in the evenings and weekends comes off of mobile devices now. It's iPhones and tablets. It's home connected TVs, things like this, not sort of the traditional desktop computers that we see in enterprise environments.
That's really interesting. And are there any, in terms of those, how did it update your thinking about the internet? I mean, you've already talked to that a little bit in terms of the security, but is there any other way that study updated your thinking about user behavior on the internet, or how you're approaching or thinking about, say, security, for example?
Yeah. So one of the things that it really pushed us to look at is oftentimes we think of the internet sort of as this big global sort of homogenous thing. There's the internet. One of the things that was, I think, the research community doing for a long time has looked at these websites that were like the top 1 million websites on the internet, right? It makes sense. Like, study the most popular websites. You sort of have these lists that you maintain and you research. You have to start somewhere. One of the things that was really interesting was how different countries are in this. And this was sort of the first time we had the ability to sort of tease apart and say, what does internet sort of web behavior look like in different continents, in different countries? What's really interesting is some countries, right, sort of use major global providers. And they use these sort of American providers. And other folks are using much more sort of internally developed sort of systems. If you look at sort of where does traffic go in South Korea, it looks totally different than where does it look like in South Africa. And there's sort of these really interesting country-specific phenomenon, right? You see sort of different, different strategies for security. We see sort of things operating on different timelines. And this really brought us sort of this new question of understanding of, like, what are the actual differences between countries and how they use the internet, how they're centralizing. And we sort of had this, I think, broad notion in the research community that the internet is becoming more centralized. And this is sort of a big theme that there's a lot of talk about and actually a lot of worry about is if all of the internet traffic is going to a small number of players, like, what does that mean? The internet was sort of originally envisioned as being this fully distributed sort of network. But what's interesting is that there is sort of regionalization that's happening. There is centralization that is happening. There's sort of isolationist sort of tendencies in some places. But what's really interesting is to sort of like tease these apart. And this is now a new active area of research that we're looking at is like, what does it really mean for the internet to be centralized? Because in some cases, the providers could actually be really small, but they could suck up all the traffic in that one country. In some other places, people that we think of as being really big, like Amazon EC2, actually don't necessarily have the same weight globally. They have a lot in each of these countries, but they don't necessarily have a massive amount of traffic in any one country. And so if you think about GCP or Google Cloud and these folks, and you think about these big cloud providers, I think in the US, we sort of think of these as the folks forcing centralization. And what we see in some cases is, in fact, they don't actually have much effect on centralization when you actually start to look at this at the country granularity.
That's incredibly interesting. There's almost what's it called, like maybe a Simpsons paradox here, where Amazon is the biggest provider, but it's
Mhm.
not the biggest provider in any single region, kind of
Exactly.
thing. So that's incredibly interesting. And I do, as the next step, I want to get into talking more about the business and the governance side of
Mhm.
things. We're getting a lot of questions around that. Maybe one more thing while we're on this, while we're on, this kind of research project is it seems like a lot of your research does depend on scanning or web crawling.
Mhm.
What are some of the what are some of the ethical or practical approaches to thinking through that kind of research? And I know, and we're going to talk about it at the end, that you have you teach a class, and I believe one of the projects is to do some web analysis,
Mhm.
and one of the big things is you're really going to someone's website. You've got to think about the implications of that. So can you talk through, as you're conducting this research, how do you do that in a responsible and ethical way?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a big question for us and there's sort of many different aspects of it. We're going from connecting to all of these systems on the internet. How do we make sure we don't harm any of them, right? We don't accidentally knock over one of these systems. And there's a lot of work we do to test the sort of scanners we're building to ensure that they don't harm any systems. We go to great lengths to make sure it's really clear who's doing the scanning and why, what we're trying to do. We make it really easy for people to opt out of these scans and say, hey, we don't want to participate in this research. How do you make it easier for them to get in touch with us or just to even understand what we're doing? And what we find in a lot of times is when people do reach out to us, it's sort of like, what are you doing? Why are you connecting to me? And we explain like what we're doing and why we're doing it and the types of things we've been able to do in the past with that data. People are okay with it. However, we have to explain who we are, why we're doing this, and sort of what we're trying to do to make the world better from it. And I think part of this is also how do we take these results and sort of make the internet actually safer and more secure as a result? Not to simply stop and say, we've done the measurement, you have these problems, let's move on to the next sort of question we want to answer. But we do a lot of work with browsers to say, okay, how do we improve these protocols? We work with standards groups to say, okay, we see these problems and how they're being deployed. How do we fix this in the next revision of this protocol? We've done a lot of work on how you do very widespread notifications of vulnerability. So we've done a lot of work with like CISA to say, okay, here are sort of utilities that are actually vulnerable. And we're seeing attacks against these types of systems. Here are the systems. Can you work with them to fix themselves? And actually say, how do we get this information out? What do we need to provide to people to help them be more secure? So a lot of it is we start with the measurement on the research side, but a lot of it is how do you take this sort of the full length and say, how do we actually improve the security of these systems? How do we notify people about the problems of their systems? And for the most part, this is well received. For us to reach out and say, we're not selling you anything. We're not trying to tell you anything. There's this problem. Here's why we think you need to solve it. And sort of here are some instructions for doing this. And we've done a lot of work on how do you phrase that? How do you make that communication sort of effective? How do you communicate that you're not an attacker, right? Because we go through all this phishing training, we go through all these messages that say, be skeptical of any email you ever receive, right? It's probably an attacker. And the reality is it probably is an attacker. So why is it that you should sort of follow these instructions? And this is, again, why relationships with folks like the EPA and with CISA, with the FBI are so important, is for helping to disseminate this information, actually get these systems secured in practice.
So that I think is a nice segue maybe to thinking about another. So we talked a little bit about user behavior, and again, we could talk about it, I'm sure, for another 10 hours. But thinking about the governance and the business side of things, I wanted to transition into that. And maybe we could start by, if you could share a little bit more about your background, because I think one of the things that's interesting is you had some experience kind of on the business side of the internet, and that led, or it seems like that might have spurred or inspired some of your research or your thoughts about the approach to studying the internet. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So part of this course, the modern internet that I started, really came out of the fact that I had started a security company, and we actually had to go out. We had to buy servers and put them on the internet, and we had to peer with other ISPs at internet exchange points. So we had to figure out where should we deploy these servers, and who do we buy IP addresses from, and how do you buy internet, and like how do you choose if you have sort of ISP A and ISP B that you can buy internet from? What are you supposed to negotiate in that contract for internet? And there's this whole complex ecosystem sort of on the back end. And we don't think about this as consumers, right? That usually we can only buy internet from Comcast or Mediacom or one of these providers at our homes. So we don't think about this. But the sort of the underside of this is there's this whole ecosystem of different internet service providers, and they have strengths and they have weaknesses. They have geographic areas that they have sort of more connectivity in than others. And you have to think about these questions of, we send packets from this point or from this other point, which of them is more likely to get to the destination? Which of these are likely to get there faster? And what I realized is there's this sort of whole part of the internet we don't want to talk about in networking courses, where we sort of talk about, here's what's been standardized, right? We talk about protocols like BGP, and we say packets go sort of the shortest path across the internet. The reality is that's not true. The reality is they go across the cheapest path of the internet, not the shortest paths of the internet, because the core of the internet is not a public service. It is run by large corporations, right? You have what we call these tier one providers. And these are folks like Verizon and AT&T and NTT and GTT, and they're businesses. And they think about these questions that say, if we send the packet on this path versus this other path, which is cheaper? At this time of day, where is there traffic? How should we route traffic so we can minimize sort of the amount of infrastructure we have to purchase? And at the scale that these companies are operating, these can have massive financial impacts of how you move packets around on your network. Just even the question of how fast you can make the decision of where to send that packet can have massive impacts. You see companies like Google and Meta actually laying their own submarine cable now, right? And these are massive billions of dollars investments to run cables between continents so that they sort of have control over how their packets flow. And all of this means that shortest path is really not how things happen. But we have to talk about that. We oftentimes don't. We start to talk about the algorithms. We talk about what is in the sort of standards, and we say, yeah, companies can do something different if they want to. But we don't talk about how they do in practice. And I think going out and actually having to peer onto the internet and having to do these things and have to run these calculations and having to redline these contracts for what do I want in the SLA for my packets on the internet made me say there's actually a whole bunch of other content to talk about. And the internet has shifted. We used to think about the internet as being this very hierarchical sort of thing. All of us were sort of at the edge of it, right? You had all of these small regional ISPs, right? And all of those would connect to sort of the bigger ISPs, right? Someone who covered a couple of states. And those sort of mid-sized ISPs would all connect to sort of the core of the internet, the backbone of the internet, the AT&Ts and the Verizons, and they would take our traffic internationally. They would take it across the continental US. And a lot of that's changed, right? We have folks like Comcast now will say to Netflix, why don't you pay us? Like, you're the one who wants to send your video to our users. Our users are paying you. Why should we pay you for you to charge our users to watch your video? And you can make the argument like who's right or wrong, but the reality is like, this is now like a contractual issue between like Comcast and Netflix. And Netflix is so big that like this whole everyone is small and the edge goes away. There's so much traffic that goes to Netflix or to Amazon or to Cloudflare that this whole like pretty hierarchical thing has really kind of crumbled. And most of this traffic, if you're sending from point A to point B, might not go through the core of the internet anymore. And we like to teach it, right? We like to say all this internet goes to the core. It starts on the edge and it sort of traverses from smaller to bigger, back down to smaller. But the reality is it might not. It might just go from Comcast to Netflix. It might never leave Comcast because Netflix has shipped physical server equipment to Comcast in order for that packet to not go on the internet. And it is cheaper for them to buy servers and send them to Comcast to put in their network than it is to keep sending these packets. And all of these things are the types of things you start to realize when you actually have to look at where do the packets go, and how do I change where they're going to sort of meet my own business needs.
There's a ton to unpack there, and I want to come back to the class maybe at the end to talk through why you think it's important, and again coming back to that philosophy. or that experience that led to you realizing how important this is, something that's just not spoken of enough in
Yeah.
computer science departments. I guess my follow-up question here, which is, and I don't have it phrased quite right, but broadly speaking, you were talking about this this hierarchical model. I grew up in the Bay Area in the 90s, so I have this very techno-libertarian vision of the internet as, the classic one is, the cathedral and the bazaar. This is the bazaar that's just this marketplace, which actually is similar to what you're describing.
Yeah.
And what's the other one is rough consensus and run code and rough consensus. Those aphorisms that just, to me, seem, still define the internet in my mind, I guess, in some sense. And you're saying it's changed. The nature of the internet is just fundamentally, almost sociologically or business side changing. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, and also talk a little bit more about the governance or the political side of it and how you're seeing that influence it. So you touched on that earlier when you said you're seeing real country level or regional differences in internet usage and approaches to security. Could you come back to that and talk a little bit how you're seeing, if you've laid this picture of maybe the business side of things and how that's changing it, how are the politics coming in and changing the nature of the internet? Sorry, it took me a while to get to that question.
No, it's complicated for sure. I think when we all began, we did sort of have this techno-libertarian sort of view of everyone on the internet will connect to everyone else, and this will be sort of this pure sort of notion. And a lot of that does still exist, right? For the most part, the internet still is very open. We do still have big standards groups like the IETF where people come together and we sort of decide where to go. But you also have a lot of heavyweights on sort of the technical side now, right? You have groups like Google and Facebook, right, who have really vested interest, right, in the performance sort of notions of this. You have big manufacturers like Cisco and Juniper, who also have sort of their business that they're trying to sell. And a lot of these, some of these new protocols like QUIC. So QUIC is a protocol that sort of replaces TLS in some situations with something that was developed by Google in Chrome, and then was deployed by several big websites like Google and Facebook and others. And a massive amount of the internet traffic that people spent on a daily basis started going over QUIC, simply because, right, Google Chrome implemented it, and several big companies implemented it. And it wasn't a protocol that was ever ratified. It was just a protocol that these folks decided, this is going to give us better performance. This is going to allow us to get content in front of people's eyeballs faster. And we have enough internal testing to say, we're going to deploy this to the world. And now later on, sort of the standards community has caught up. They've come and they've said, okay, this was interesting. This worked. Let's take this and let's standardize it. And now QUIC is used everywhere, but it didn't start in a standards body. It started because Google and Facebook and a couple of others said, we're doing this. And sort of the world caught up with it. You also have other policy areas that aren't necessarily run by sort of these standards group, but are just run by browsers. So a big example here is every time you connect to a website, that website essentially hands you what we call a certificate that says, I really am bankofamerica.com, and you can sort of trust that no one in this coffee shop has intercepted this connection and is trying to steal your username and password. I am the real bankofamerica.com. And the way this works is we have what are called certificate authorities, or these big companies that we trust to vouch for the identity of websites. So essentially, someone like DigiCert, which is one of these CAs, says, this really is bankofamerica.com. We have verified it. And Google, your browser, Chrome, says, we trust that DigiCert sort of does this due diligence. The reality is the browsers are the ones who decide who you trust. This isn't something that is figured out by like the UN or by Congress or anyone. The browsers say, here's who we trust. And this is actually a good thing, right? Because they actually have the ability to make these sort of nuanced technical decisions of who is acting properly and who is not. But it's also a lot of power to decide, right, who you're going to trust. And we've seen countries come out and say, well, why should we trust Google, this US-based company, decide like which websites you're allowed to connect to? Like, why isn't this something that our government controls? Why is it something that we want to have a certificate authority in our country that operates under our laws and legislation, right? Not under US or EU law. And it becomes this question of like, well, how's this going to play out between the browsers, right, these tech companies and governments? And this is something that's comes up a lot is you have governments and you sort of have the internet, which is this international sort of entity that's managed by a lot of different companies. And how should legislation and regulation work? And the internet, for the most part, I think, is becoming more balkanized as time goes on, as there's more geopolitical conflict. People are saying, do we want other countries to have access to this content? We've seen countries come out and say, look, we don't want these AI companies scraping this content. We've seen China put up this great firewall of content to censor which content comes over their sort of national border. We're starting to see this in many different countries, and the internet's not as open and as sort of free as it once was. And it's something that we're really only figuring out through large-scale internet measurements. What sites are accessible from some countries that are not accessible from others? When the Russia-Ukrainian war broke out, what did this mean in terms of how traffic was routed in Eastern Europe? And all of this conflict does change sort of this internet substrate, and it's something that is changing on a sort of continuous basis as countries are reacting, and it's happening everywhere. But it's sort of changing this dynamic from being this one sort of very free and open sort of internet to something where people, I think of this community is trying to figure out how do we work with governments. In the US, right, we look at like the ban on TikTok, right? I think this is another example of this, right? We don't want, we've decided that we don't want content like essentially controlled by another country to be used in an app here. Well, then, okay. Which countries are we okay having run apps? Which ones are we not? Right? There's all of these sort of questions that I think the community is grappling with, and there aren't really clear answers to any of them right now. It's something that is very much in motion. And even within the US, all right, there's a lot of disagreement right now about what is misinformation and propaganda versus sort of what are differing viewpoints on an issue. And this is something that is very gray. There's very little black and white in these types of questions that are being grappled with now.
That's great. Maybe we could build on that. We've gotten a couple questions of, there are obviously a lot of things around that topic of content, of internet content specifically. Is it good for you, right? I mean, I just saw another one is Instagram is bad, lowers kids' self-esteem, or Facebook actually is good for self-esteem. So have you done some research around that? And what have been your approaches to thinking about either health or not security per se, but kind of you might call, trolling or internet abuses or misinformation. So what are some of the information, what have you looked at, and, what do you see as the state of the art of research in trying to even understand those phenomena?
Yeah, no, my group has. And we've really looked at both sort of the hate and harassment side, and then some sort of the propaganda and disinformation side of the internet. Hate and harassment is a major problem. Right, this is something that affects a huge portion of users online, and it has real world detrimental effect, right, on mental health, particularly for younger adults. It's also one of these things that's nuanced. What one person thinks is hateful, another person might not. What people need to see to do their jobs might be surprising, right? We had a study recently where we were working with journalists to say, how do we make social media essentially usable for you when the majority of messages you may receive might be abusive, right? And every time you log onto this platform, most of the messages you get are sort of are these hateful messages. And there are nuances to this, right? You need to know as a journalist, right? How are people reacting to the stories you write? How do you engage with that community? How do you actually not want to filter out all of this, but maybe say, hey, if these things are actually actionable threats, we don't want to filter them out. I need them to bubble to the top so that I know for my physical safety that these threats are being made against me. We've looked at platforms like Reddit and tried to understand sort of what are the different ways harassment happens, which I think in many ways sort of know this harassment happens. But again, it's sort of this deeply nuanced. There's different personas. There are different types of harassment. There's a big difference between sort of these one-off interactions where a conversation gets heated and sort of becomes abusive versus sort of these trolls who might go after and track people across different platforms, or might bring together sort of a small army to go and attack an individual. And the solutions to those problems are going to be very different. But we need to look at this data and sort of understand the nuance of the different types of attacks, the different types of abusers, to understand these nuances on why some people think a comment is abusive while others don't. And there's a lot of work to be done here. This is one of these sort of interesting areas that spans everything from psychology, right, and the social sciences, all the way to natural language processing. How do you make sense of these comments sort of at scale and do these types of measurements? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but it is one of these areas that we really have to take both sort of the technical side of it, but also really work with our counterparts in other departments and say, how do we make sense of this complex issue? Because it's not this black and white security where there's an attack and we simply need to filter it out. It's going to have much more complex human-focused solutions. In many ways, it may be something that technology is sort of amplifying existing problems. And if we don't understand those underlying sort of human aspects of this, we might end up doing much more harm than we actually do in helping. The other part we've looked at is sort of these questions around disinformation and propaganda. And again, the part that my group is really interested in is how do we track how information spreads on the internet? We are not ourselves social science, and discerning whether or not a story is true or false is a really hard question. It's something where you oftentimes need to have a deep understanding of the politics involved, of the players. It's something that investigative journalists and other folks we think are in a much better position to sort of make sense of. Oftentimes stories there's some kernel of truth to sort of every story. What we're interested in, though, is asking questions of saying, okay, where did this story start online? Right? Is this something that started out of a Russian propaganda site? Is this something that started on social media? Or is this something that started for the first time through sort of a mainstream media source? Can we track sort of how that information flows online? And this is something that what we want to do is sort of enable social scientists to be able to do research about how the internet works. So how can we take our sort of large scale systems? How can we take sort of advances in natural language processing and say, okay, if you want to think about this topic, here's where it's been covered online. Here's where it started. Here's sort of the flow it took online for you to then go and do deeper social science research on those topics.
Really interesting. So, I mean, there's a lot there. Again, it's just building the tools in order to even collect the data at scale that then you sort of, you maybe perform a more qualitative or statistical analysis, but informed by your understanding of human behavior, human cognition, all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And just creating a taxonomy of, these broad categories is itself an incredibly complicated and fraught task. That's really interesting. So we're nearing the end of our time. So what I would love to do maybe is to talk a little bit more about your class, the modern internet. So I do want to say, if anyone's interested, you are able to enroll in that class as a professional student if you meet the prerequisites, which I think are a background in computer science and networking. But you have all this research. You're talking about all these kind of interesting nuances to the way the internet actually operates. So can you talk a little bit more about what was the inspiration for this class? And maybe another way to put it is, what do you think is really important for your average computer science or your average programmer to understand about the internet that they might not from just a conventional programming or computer science background?
Yeah, I think for me what it is we oftentimes focus on sort of the networking fundamentals in the curriculum to start. And thinking about the internet is a little bit different than thinking about networking. Networking is absolutely a huge part of it, but right, you do have the business piece, you have the governance piece, you have sort of these misaligned incentives around how all of this works, and trying to understand what that looks like. What protocols are actually used? Like, where does your traffic actually go on the internet? And I think the first project is actually a great exemplar of this. The first project in the class is that you yourselves have to go and actually join the internet. So we give you a router, and we sort of tell you who your upstream ISP is, and you have to go announce yourself to the internet as a new network. And what you get back is every other network on the internet who's announcing its presence. And then from there, we look at, well, who are the biggest networks, right? What are sort of the differences? Where does your traffic go in ways that you just wouldn't expect? And like, why do you think it's doing that? Once you have this internet connection, we set up honeypots. We look at what do attackers do when you're on the internet? What is the actual attack traffic that you receive by just being on the internet? We go and we actually crawl websites and say, okay, we keep talking about how there's all these privacy concerns about websites and sort of third-party cookies and ads and tracking and all of this. But now that you have actually the top million websites on the internet, what ad providers are on them? Like, who are they? What ad providers are showing up on these healthcare sites? And so it's a much more empirical class. All of the projects in the class are going out and measuring how does the internet actually work. Not how do we want it to work, not how might it theoretically work, but how does it actually work? And we sort of build from the bottom up at the routing and saying, okay, like you have the routing table now for the full internet. Who are the players? And like these players, you realize you never even heard of a lot of them. These biggest players who are on the backbone of the internet are folks that are just not household names, and they're critically important, but it's not something you think about or talk about in networking class. We talk about governance. We talk about how much does an IP address cost, right? Like we're out. Like they're no longer free. So where do you go? Like you have to go join an auction, right? And put in a bid and get an IP address. Like what does that look like? And so a lot of it is saying, how does the internet actually work today? How do new standards happen? Where does your traffic go? What protocols are actually in use? But we want folks to come out of the class and say, we actually have a really good understanding now of like, when a computer is on the internet, what happens? Where does that go? When I actually connect to Netflix, what happens? Like, where are my packets going? Do they go over the core of the internet or they do not? Like, why not? And those types of questions, I think, are important for architecting future systems, because you don't want to architect systems based on sort of how the internet might have used to work 20 or 30 years ago, right? You want to architect systems based on how the internet works today. Like, what are the real actual implications of using a cloud provider or a content distribution network? What traffic, if you decide to use Google Analytics on your site, does Google have access to? When you decide to sort of copy and paste that JavaScript into your file. These are the types of questions that we want folks to have a better understanding of coming out of the class.
I'm assuming it also gives them the ability to maybe in 10 years to look again and say, oh, it's changed again.
It's changing. I know. This is one of the funny things about this class is we have to change it every year because all of the numbers change. New protocols come out. New things are deprecated. Companies, right, rise and fall. All of this is something that's really quite dynamic, and it's fun to teach too, because you have people who do these projects who come back and say, who's this? And you realize, like, I don't know who that is. I've never heard of them. They didn't exist last year, but they're now, right, a real player in the space.
Zakir, we had a great question from one of the participants, is what would be, assuming kind of unlimited resources, or even given the resources you have, what do you think is the next big research project you want to do in order to kind of, to broaden your understanding? What's the area that's of the internet still a mystery to you? What are you interested in your next big research project?
Oh, I mean, it's hard to pick just one, because at each layer there are so many of these questions to make sense of. I mean, the satellite piece I think is really interesting, right? This is an entirely sort of new dynamic. Like we sort of had cell networks and we had, right, like landline networks, but we haven't really had satellite-based communication. Like, what does this mean for protocols that we use for things like TCP? This is, I think, a big sort of open question. The other piece that I'm really sort of interested in still is understanding more sort of the real world aspects of how attacks happen and what defenses really work to protect against them. So we've done a lot of this empirical work about sort of the network and about the internet and about protocols. A lot of my interest today too is how do we start to collect the same type of data about attacks? How do we start to make sense of what defenses are in there and not? Right now, we don't really know what defenses really work. We sort of buy things based on what we think sort of like groupthink says works. But we don't have hard data that says, this is what it means to get MFA right. And this is the place you need to deploy it. And I'm really interested in understanding sort of how do we take these sort of this approach and use it for understanding that.
I think we're just about at the end, so I really appreciate you making the time to talk through the modern internet to explain it. And if you want more, so first of all, in your console, you can link to up in your upper right-hand side, you'll see a link to a description of the course that we talked about, the modern internet, if you're interested in that. There are some other courses that Zakir teaches that we link to below. And when we send out the recording, we'll include a link to your lab. So
awesome. Thank
great.
you.
Thank you so much, Zakir. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Thanks.